Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar, where our focus will be on the energy transition for corporates. My name's Vivek Bakshi. I'm a partner in Canada, and I also lead Denton's Global Energy Sector Group. And I'm delighted to be hosting this session with you today. So today is the last installment of our current ESG Global Webinar series, and we've obviously saved the best for last with the energy transition. The global webinar series is focused on bringing you practical insights into some of the most topical ESG issues facing you and your teams. Over the last few months, we've explored a range of areas. We've done ESG-related litigation, ESG in supply and value chains, financing sustainability, and ESG reporting and disclosure. If any of these issues are on your priority list and you missed the session, do drop us a line at esgprogram@dentons.com to request the recording links and materials. So with that context in mind, today's session is really about you and your issues. So we're really keen for you to use the chat function to unmute and ask questions and to ensure that we provide you with the practical takeaways that you need. So in turning to our speakers now, I'm delighted to be joined by a number of my colleagues from around the world who are in our energy group. So let's start with introductions, and I'll go to David first.
Thank you, Vivek, and thank you for turning in to join this important program. I'm Dave McGimsey. I'm a Denton's partner and the energy co-leader for the U.S. region. I'm based in Indiana and practice as a utility regulatory lawyer in the energy and water sectors. And my discussion today is going to focus on the outcome of the U.S. election and the decarbonization opportunity presented by district energy, which some of you may know as district heating or district cooling. So now I'll pass the baton back to you, Vivek. Thanks.
Thanks. Let's go north now to Hazel Safri, who is in Calgary.
Thank you, and welcome everyone to the session today. I am an energy partner in Calgary, so we are very much involved with energy transition on a real stage. We see a lot of transition happening through the oil fields, through different types of energy companies, incorporating renewables and incorporating carbon into their practice. Today, I'm going to be speaking a little bit about how to incorporate carbon offsets into the energy transition forum, and then also a little bit about the infrastructure that we're seeing in Canada from both our federal and local governments that are promoting this transition.
Thanks, Hazel. Why don't we go next to Christian, who's in Warsaw?
Hello. Hi, Vivek. Hello, everybody. Christian Schnell. I'm a dual-mitted Polish and German lawyer from both, obviously, energy companies, but as well corporates and as well financial institutions when it comes to energy investments, all types in that region.
Thanks, Christian. And finally, Claudia Thomas in London.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Claudia Thomas. I'm a partner in the projects team in London. Having previously worked as a lawyer for UK government on energy policy, I focus on energy regulation, and my client base covers both energy companies looking for advice on the regulatory picture, but also helping public sector entities designing new market mechanisms in the UK. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. So today is going to be a practical session focused on our experience helping large global organizations navigate the energy transition. So we've structured the seminar into three parts. In the first part, we'll look at the global energy market and provide a global regulatory outlook. And I think as part of that, we're keen to hear from David on the likely implications of the events of Tuesday night. Second up, we'll do a deeper dive into some key themes that we're seeing from a client perspective and that we think would be of value for you to consider. And last, it's the opportunity for you to get involved. We'll move to a discussion and close out the hour by addressing Q&A. So let's get started by looking at the European regulatory landscape with Christian.
Thanks a lot, Vivek. So just to give you a little bit of flavor about what's happening in Europe, I think you all are aware that Europe is a front runner when it comes to carbon neutrality. The goal is really to be completely net zero by 2050 and to be almost net zero already by 2040. So that's from the investment horizon really close by. The general tool which is in place is a national energy and climate plan, which is applicable to each EU member state. It is rolled every 2 years, and it is ultimately covering the Paris targets. And this national energy and climate plan ultimately includes all measures you can think about, including state aid notification, which ultimately means that in case you as a government, obviously it as well reflects you as corporates, but if a local government, national government plans to introduce whatever type of measures and policies, it has to notify this, and it has to update it every 2 years. And this is already happening since 2020 with quite a success. Obviously, the smaller the EU member state, the less valuable is sometimes the content of the policies, but everybody's picking up, and the EU Commission obviously is of support when it comes to that. The major ultimately tool for driving this net zero scenario is a program which is called Next Generation EU, which is under the EU budget. It is, as you see, quite a substantial amount of money, which is either provided in grants or in loans. And 40% of that program goes into climate action. And then you have as well additional facilities like, for example, REPowerEU, which is a little bit an answer to the energy crisis Europe had during the last 2-3 years. Right now, it's already recovering, but this was obviously mainly caused by the gas prices peaking and provided a lot of uncertainty, obviously related to the war outbreak when it comes to Russia invading into Ukraine. Then what we have additionally is an emissions trading system, which is very much advanced, but it covers for the time being only sectors like mainly energy, but it will cover in the near future as well buildings and transportation, which is a major impact because obviously everybody knows there's a building as well emits CO2, transportation as well. So this will then as well cover ultimately the whole economy, and you wherever you emit, you have ultimately an emission button on it, and you have to trade emissions in the future. And this, of course, is a completely new environment for everybody participating in the economy. And then there was as well, just to mention that as well, jointly with REPowerEU, a Net Zero Industry Act. This is ultimately for reducing energy import dependency, obviously mainly from Russia, as you may know. So gas and but of course as well partly oil and even coal. So this is a bit of as well reshuffling everything. And then on the other hand, the EU is very much focused on key technologies to sponsor, and maybe just the few technologies which are of impact for you as a corporate. Obviously, solar PV and solar thermal is sponsored. As well, everything which provides to so-called indirect electrification, meaning hydrogen economy, electrolyzers and fuel cells, is something where you can get either grants or preferred loans. Next thing of importance is biomethane, biogas, anyhow, biofuels, all type of it. That's something which as well can be sponsored. Then Europe puts a very much large emphasizes behind the whole battery and storage economy, where Europe, to be honest, is for the time being lacking behind. So this is clearly something where China is right now leading. So it's a little bit a question as well of reducing the import dependency. The next thing which is of importance for you or might be of importance is heat pumps, so-called direct electrification. That's a clear technology for the future because it's very efficient. And then finally, as well, grid technologies here of interest is, I think, for corporates, mainly the EV charging infrastructure as well here, preferred loans and funds available. So that's maybe in a nutshell what right now is happening in Europe.
Thanks, Christian. And I think what's remarkable about the story in the EU is the pace of change, in particular since the Ukraine conflict. So it's been really instructive to see how the EU has tackled those dual issues of energy security and sustainability in a very quick fashion. So why don't we turn now to Claudia in London?
Thank you, Vivek. So I'm going to talk through the regulatory landscape in the UK. You may see similarities with the frameworks which Christian has mentioned. Whilst the UK is no longer bound to follow EU requirements, in practice, policymakers are likely to continue to look closely at developments in our neighbouring countries. The UK tends to want to aim high in terms of low carbon commitments, and the EU is a useful comparator, but obviously there are others as well. So in terms of aiming high, the UK was one of the first major economies to introduce a net zero target in legislation binding on the government. This says that the UK will reach net zero compared to 1990 emissions levels by 2050, with various interim targets on the way. Whilst there are currently no binding net zero requirements on corporates, this government commitment does permeate through the economy. And it has been supported by governments of different colours since it was introduced, although there isn't always agreement on exactly how to get there. So in terms of the regulatory landscape for corporates, this of course varies by sector. For high emitters, there will be environmental permit obligations to actually reduce or completely eradicate certain emissions. And we also, having left the EU, have the UK emissions trading system, which imposes a cap and trade system for certain industries, aviation and energy intensive industries, with the cap reducing over time to lower emissions. But this only covers certain markets. Now, I know that reporting has been covered in a separate session, but it is very relevant to corporates, and there are increasing reporting requirements which require companies to understand their full supply chain emissions and how they intend to manage these. So, for example, some entities above a certain size operating in the EU market will be subject to certain corporate sustainability legislation in due course, including conducting due diligence and reporting on emissions. And voluntarily, many companies are being encouraged to set science-based targets and to prepare net zero transition plans. It's not inconceivable that future regulation might impose binding requirements in this regard, but that isn't something that's been announced at present. So moving on now to incentives and standards, I will cover this in a bit more detail later, but for now it's interesting to note that for large power users who are buying electricity, that often if they're buying from a renewable generator, that generator may well have benefited from a government subsidy and therefore have a level of revenue certainty which they wouldn't otherwise have. So there's also a lot of change, as Vivek's mentioned, and the same goes for the UK. So there's various market reform projects. These are to make the gas and electricity systems, both in terms of the legal and the physical infrastructure, to make them fit for net zero and a grid with a lot more renewable power on it. So, for example, Denton's has worked recently on the creation of a new body, the National Energy System Operator, which is the new ESO, and will take a system-wide approach to managing gas and electricity networks in a way that hasn't been done before. The government is also carrying out a comprehensive review of electricity market arrangements. That's the so-called REMA, and that's looking at all non-retail aspects of electricity markets. And in due course, that may bring significant change to how power pricing works, including by region, to how technologies compete with each other, and also to how large consumers interact with the market. Largely, I'll quickly mention standards. So these, in some cases, are evolving at pace. So, for example, hydrogen, aviation fuel, sustainable aviation fuel standards are changing. Then there are some mechanisms such as the Renewable Guarantees of Origin, or REGOs, which are well understood by the market. I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Claudia. And why don't we go straight away over to David?
Thank you, Vivek. Well, I think many of you know that the US elections were held earlier this week, and I'm sure you're aware that Donald Trump won the presidency, so he will be sworn in January of 2025. Republicans took control of the Senate and appear well on their way to taking control of the House. So that means the Republicans will be in control of both the executive and legislative branches in the next at least 2 years of Donald Trump's second term. And so I'll take a look at where we can see decarbonization efforts going in light of the Trump administration and the context of 4 macro trends in the energy sector. And these are the 4 trends. The first macro is rising power demand and the effect on prices. So after decades of stagnant or even falling demand, the rise of AI-related industries, data centers, semiconductor manufacturing, Bitcoin, mining, and other energy-intensive industries have caused a sudden and unexpected increase in power demand in the U.S. The result has been strained resources, thin reserve margins, and rising power prices. So in the Trump administration, I anticipate in order to stem those rising power prices and keep more power on the grid, that extended coal plant life cycles and relaxed environmental regulations affecting the oil and gas industry, as well as the power production industry will come into play, and look for potential repeal of laws and regulations that target carbon reduction, including portions of the Inflation Reduction Act, all of which will likely be supported by a Republican-controlled Congress. So the second macro is the continued clean energy transition. You may know that President Trump has indicated he will pull the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement, but I don't think the energy transition is going to go away. There will be a U.S. federal pullback in all likelihood, especially in certain elements of that Inflation Reduction Act. For example, I think electric vehicle programs, tax credits, and incentives are likely to be on the chopping block. Offshore wind is another area that could see pullbacks. So those are how I see the continued clean energy transition moving from a federal level. So with the federal pullback, I see that state and local governments, as well as the corporates, are going to be the new leaders in the energy transition. And another element of this energy transition from a macro perspective is that clean energy developers continue to confront strong local opposition, and that opposition may be emboldened by the recent U.S. elections. So I think that is going to cause a lot of the commercial and industrial PPAs that have been entered into over the last 10 or so years harder to come by. I don't think that PPA market is going away in any sense of the word, but I do think it's going to be tougher for clean energy developers to bring their projects online, which will affect that C&I PPA market. So the third macro is the anticipated nuclear renaissance. You may know that the U.S. passed bipartisan legislation this past summer called the ADVANCE Act, and nuclear energy is increasingly seen as a solution to the power demands that AI-related industries are putting on the electric grid, which I referenced earlier when discussing that first macro. And my perspective is that the Trump administration will support development of nuclear power, such as continuing to streamline permitting processes, possible implementation of additional tax credits, and other actions consistent with facilitating SMRs and other new advanced nuclear technologies. The fourth macro consists of the ongoing challenges to EPA rules. There are multiple challenges pending regarding EPA rules on mercury, methane, and carbon emissions. Those challenges may be aided by legislative and executive action, overturning those regulations without the need for further litigation. And so that is my view of the 4 macros in the Trump administration, and I'll turn it back to you, Vivek. Thank you.
Thanks, David. And I think it's interesting. It's a very different approach to get to the same end game. But anyway, we can develop that thought a bit more later. So now over to Hazel.
Thank you. So just looking at the Canadian regulatory landscape, we also, similar to a lot of jurisdictions, do have a net zero goal for 2050. We have that enshrined in legislation as well through our Emissions Reductions Act. But what we're seeing is, as a result of that, a lot of federal, either you would say pressure or incentives to start moving towards the transition and encouraging energy transition. So we're seeing on a federal level, a lot of increased capital support. I just listed a few here, but those investment tax credits are significant, and they can do up to, say, 30–40% of certain capital costs. I said CCUS and clean technology, but there's also a clean manufacturing one. There's also a hydrogen ITC. We also have the clean fuel regulations, which are federal level. And again, what they're doing is they're reducing emissions of essentially of your gasoline and diesel over time so that it's much more cleaner. So it's restricting the use, the carbon intensity of those fuels over time, encouraging the technology development, encouraging biofuels, encouraging blending, encouraging EV use. We have also the clean electricity regulations, which are proposed. And for example, one of the large items under that is if you are using natural gas, it has to, natural gas can only be used for new plants when it's about 30 tons of carbon per gigawatt hour. So what that results in is a push towards CCUS again, where we're seeing the emissions from those plants being sequestered underground, and that's how they might meet that emissions restriction. Another thing that's being talked about, and then again was raised this week when the federal government released the new proposed oil and gas emissions cap. Essentially, what we're saying is we want to reduce our emissions 35% below our 2019 emissions that resulted from the oil production. So oil and gas production in 2019, 35% of that by theoretically 2030. That obviously is, going to push quite a bit of industry to reinvent how they are doing production and whether or not they're going to continue to produce. And then also we have this focus on reconciliation. So reconciliation is the process, both economic, social, community, developmental, of reconciliation between First Nations in Canada and the federal and provincial and local governments. So we are seeing a big push when we're seeing these transition projects and focus by federal and provincial governments to also encourage First Nation development. So we want to see a certain amount of Indigenous ownership of certain projects. We want to see skills, labor, proper use of lands, a plan for reclamation ahead of time, all of those good things in place in order to forward our ambitions for reconciliation. We also are seeing more disclosure requirements on the emission side and sustainability. That is very much linking towards the United States and some European requirements. We are also seeing the Competition Bureau, so that's a federal entity, has put in anti-greenwashing legislation. This is, of course, if we're going to be doing the transition, we want to be doing it in a manner that is true and can be tracked through international standards, and disclosures are not misleading consumers, whether it's industrial consumers or it's personal or individual consumers. The other thing we're seeing is that's matching in a lot of cases is we're also seeing the provincial level support. So we have active government procurements for clean energy and storage all across Canada. Except for Alberta right now, we're a little bit slower, but that's because we have been very, very active. We see robust use of the, say, emissions trading systems within Canada, whether it's cap and trade in Quebec, the WCI, or if we're looking at the TIER program in Alberta. But now we're seeing newer ones that are becoming well used as government incentivizes them to be utilized, creating new revenue streams, incentivizing technology uptake. Lots of grants and loans, and again, lots on reconciliation. One thing I did want to just say quickly, though, is I did say challenges under the federal level. And what we are also seeing is, although we're seeing a lot of good movement towards transition, we're also seeing some of the challenges that come with, for example, putting in tariffs. And we are starting to follow along with what the US is doing in terms of tariffs on certain types of semiconductors, solar panels, items that are, or critical minerals, items that will assist in the transition and are critical for transition. So we are seeing a lot of support, but we are seeing that it's not going to be only support. We do have some factors for national security which are limiting these. So I think we can move it back to Vivek here as well.
Thanks, Hazel. So we'll move to the next session now, where we spotlight a few key themes. Now, I think before I do that, I think I'm going to hand over to Niamh, who's going to run a quick poll to get your perspective on the energy transition.
Thanks, Vivek. So as always, we're keen to get everyone's input on this topic before we continue to dive a little deeper. So as an in-house lawyer, what are the biggest challenges in managing your organization's energy transition? We're keen to hear what you think. Is it keeping up with emerging regulations, compliance, anticipating and managing new risks that emerge during that journey? Maybe it's your team and developing that expert knowledge, or it might be managing those internal stakeholders during that journey. Preventing greenwashing, reporting and disclosure, or perhaps it's something else entirely. So we'd love to get your input on this one. I can already see lots of people getting involved. So we're just going to give it a few more seconds on participation. So let's do a quick countdown. So let's go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. On this one, still votes coming in, so I'm going to hold for a last second and then we'll share the results with you all. So hopefully useful to see what everyone else on the call is also feeling in terms of energy transition. So I am going to end the poll and share the results with you all now. Okay, Vivek, this is an interesting one, maybe influenced by the round the world tour we've just had of what's happening.
Absolutely.
So keeping up with to date with emerging regulations coming out top, and then as we work down through the other options, yes, we can see that it does seem to be a mix of all. So I think a nice setting to hand it back to you and the team to work through some of the early areas you're keen to spotlight.
Thanks, Niamh. And I think maybe in the Q&A we'll come back to the issue of the pace of regulatory change and the extent to which different jurisdictions are approaching the energy transition in different ways and at different paces. But let's get into the key themes then. And I'm going to go to Christian first, who's going to focus on corporate PPAs.
Okay, so that's just an easy graph for everybody just to remember. We will ask in 5 minutes whether you get it. This is just to give you a little bit of idea what is behind the energy transition flow chart. You see on the left hand a lot of technologies with which you could either produce power, or you could produce heat, or you could ultimately produce biofuels, which then obviously goes into the transportation angle. What is with all these technologies is ultimately that they are net zero. So you will find a lot of technologies which are the typical renewables, whether they are intermittent or not intermittent, like hydro. Then you have obviously nuclear. Then you have everything which could produce combined heat power. And obviously as well, you have natural gas. Why natural gas? Because natural gas is a transition technology. And when it comes with carbon capture storage, it ultimately becomes net zero. Of course, we all know that for the time being, carbon capture storage and use technologies for the time being are quite expensive animal. And what you see then is that there's a lot of electricity generated and it goes out to heat and cooling generation. It couldn't go directly, which is the so-called direct electrification. It can go indirectly, then it's ultimately H2 hydrogen, which will be produced and it will be then distributed by networks. And obviously, you can as well store either heat or power. And there are certain, let's say, technologies, all advanced, which can store power and heat. And then ultimately, it's a question of energy service to provide wherever you come from, whether your impact is more industrial as you are, whether you are more residential, whether more commercial, whether you look for transportation, whether you look for vehicle to grid technologies, whether you want to use biofuels. So it's a whole world. But the most important thing behind all of it, if you come with power and heat generation, ultimately what you need is energy efficiency. That's the second picture, and this shouldn't be forgot, that energy efficiency is a huge part of the energy transition. And then obviously as well, another part is the circular economy. You find a little bit of the arrows back when you look on the left side at biomass CHP or biogas CHP. This is ultimately part of the circular economy, which again goes into fuels and again will be reused. And the whole picture you have to remember really to understand what's going on. And have your, let's say, make your mind out of it. But what you see already in a certain way, we come to that a little bit later, is that a lot of these things are direct electrification. And then as well, you have measures for indirect electrification. And obviously it comes in a certain way with a certain efficiency losses, because direct electrification is always better than indirect electrification because you have less energy losses down the road. And the more efficient, the cheaper it is. Quite easy. If we would go then to the next slide, just to give you a little bit idea what happens if you ultimately say, okay, fine, all understood. Let's go right now for energy procurement, because that's the moment when we have that, let's say, not only corporate PPA, but many other topics. Just to give you an overview, because it is complex. What you are used to is obviously the so-called corporate PPA. That means you just have a power purchase agreement. What you do for the time being, most of you, is most likely virtual PPAs. So it's a balancing mechanism ultimately. And if you go then to an intermittent power supplier, which just means nothing else than solar PV or wind, you would buy for them pay as produced, because that's for them the easiest way to do it. And it comes quite cheap, but it's for the time being only a balancing tool in a certain way. You could have as well a physical PPA. This, of course, is not so easy anymore, because what you'd require with your production profile, which quite often doesn't meet the generation profile of intermittent renewables, is ultimately baseload power, because you don't want to produce when the sun is shining and when the wind is blowing. And if it's neither the sunshine nor the wind is blowing, you shut off your production. Nobody will do this. So obviously then you have to go a little bit deeper. You come to certain solutions where you end up with a few technologies, or you end up as well with storage. And obviously you all know that battery storage comes cheaper and cheaper. And that's maybe as well one of the impacts of the new Trump government. Maybe you will see that batteries will become even cheaper, because there's a great competition between the US and China. But you see that Europe as well wants to go into that direction. So battery can come cheaper and cheaper. And then obviously with intermittent renewables and battery storage, you already come into the more or less baseload direction. Then you have what else you could do behind the meter. It's obviously power generation. Most of you know already solar as a service, which is ultimately a contracting model. So somebody just puts some solar panels on your roof, or you have a so-called direct wire, meaning you have a solar PV or a wind farm a few kilometers from your construction facility. You would then just directly purchase power through the direct wire, ultimately surrounding public grids. Why? Because public grids always come with a price. It's called distribution tariff, and this is quite expensive. But then you think, well, I have a logistics center, so why shouldn't I export surplus power into the grids? Nicely said, but there are many, many regulatory hurdles. So this is not an easy case, and it is in many countries the same problem, that at the moment you have surplus power, it comes with certain regulatory hurdles, and it's not that easy anymore. Then the next thing is heat supply. Again, the easy one is ultimately you are connecting to district heating, but quite often district heating still has some CO2 emissions. For example, if it is gas-fired or even worse, coal-fired, then of course this is not so good for your carbon footprint. You could think about decentralized microgrids, so-called low-temperature grids, where you could have heat pumps. But of course, then again, the question is, a heat pump is ultimately driven by the electricity, which means it comes with a certain price. You use ultimately waste heat. Maybe in your production process, you have already some waste heat. But ultimately, the question is where the power comes from. Does it come from the direct wire? You could then obviously not pay distribution tariffs if it all works well. Does it come from the grid? Then, of course, it might be expensive. So a lot of questions all around here. And then the last thing is process heat, which is, of course, something where heat pumps most likely won't make it because they come to a certain degree Celsius Fahrenheit, but then at some moment it's over. So you need really a fuel. And generally, there are two zero-emission fuels available. One is biomethane, which for the time being is a, let's say, an option which doesn't mean that you have to change all the infrastructure, gas infrastructure you might have at hand. Hydrogen is a completely different animal, different infrastructure. So here it requires as well infrastructure investments. Then EV charging, well, that's something quite similar to the solar as a service. It can be done as well in a contracting model as EV charging as a service. This is something in case you would have, for example, logistics centers say, look, I have a nice logistics center. I want to have EV charging for lorries there. So that's something which is doable, but as well from the regulatory point of view, as well from the grid point of view, not so easy, but doable. And the last thing, last but not least, is energy efficiency. Here are the so-called ESCO models, energy consumer models. And on the other hand, there are support systems in many countries which are called white certificate systems. At the moment, when you have, for example, a high emission heat supply, for example, you would change to low emission, you might get some extra support systems for that. That's something which is quite popular in the European Union, in other regions as well, in other regions may not. But generally, the whole efficiency, if you think about, let's say, changing your power and heat supply, think about energy efficiency as well, because only with energy efficiency it pays off. That's just a short overview where we are with these topics.
Thanks, Christian. Why don't we turn to Claudia now to speak to us about low carbon infrastructure growth?
Thanks very much. So good actually to follow up from that discussion, because I'm going to be talking more about how some of these technologies are incentivized through business models in the UK. So to start with, just to mention National Wealth Fund investment. And the UK now has this body, which was previously called the UK Infrastructure Bank, which provides public funding, but it does so on a sort of commercial arm's length basis. And it is intended to crowd in private sector investment into new low carbon technologies. Now, I wanted to discuss this range of interventions, but although it's a topic I enjoy, I won't have time to go into great detail. So I'll just highlight a few of the business models that exist and how they work. So firstly, grants, that's almost the most straightforward because that is money for a technology that's not yet commercialized, and it's usually for research and development purposes. CFDs for renewables is a regime that's been quite popular, I would say, for the most part, successful in the UK in really increasing the percentage of renewables on the grid. And it's a usually 15-year contract that provides revenue certainty and therefore makes a project a lot more bankable and has encouraged a lot of new renewable investment in the UK. That's been going since about 2013, so it's sort of tried and tested. The capacity market equally has been running for a while. It's not traditionally a low carbon instrument. It's more about security of supply, but it's being amended over time to make it more focused at bringing on low carbon technologies that can also provide capacity. So then I thought I would mention RAB model, so regulated asset base, because that's being used over time for industries like water, and it's a license based rather than a contract regime. But it's being rolled out in the UK for some nuclear technologies, both large nuclear and small modular reactors. The idea being that it's a better way, possibly for some technologies, it's more suitable than contracts for difference. Now, hydrogen, carbon capture, use and storage are more complicated. They also have business models, and they borrow from the CFD regime that we've seen for renewables, but because they involve creating a whole market, including in some cases transport and storage systems, they're more complicated, but these are quite well advanced, and we are awaiting announcements, and we've had some announcements recently that some projects have got to the sort of final funding stages. Last but not least, transport fuels. Of course, transport is a big part of emissions for a large company. It's not only energy, electricity use. So again, there are business models that fund transport use for vehicles, for industrial use, and also the government is introducing a new model for aviation fuel. So next slide, I will just talk about some of the issues. And based on conversations I've had with colleagues in other countries, these issues are not always unique to the UK, and you might see them around the globe in various economies. So, of course, grid connection delays is important, because for new electricity projects, it's all great if you have the funding, you have the subsidy contract. If you're not actually connected and able to generate, that doesn't help. So you need to complete the picture, and there's a lot of different interventions that need to come together, and this is something that's being worked on in the UK.
Claudia,
yeah.
Can we come to the balance of those points during Q&A?
Yeah.
And I think grid connection is really interesting, because it really feeds into Christian's point around all of these new interesting ways of getting clean energy into the supply mix. If you can't connect, then that's an issue. But we'll come back to some of these issues during Q&A. Thanks.
Sure. Do you want me to cover the last two quickly? Or do you
sure, go on if you will. Yeah.
Yeah. So I suppose the only additional things to say here is about these business models and subsidies, that they're increasingly being made dependent on the recipient making a contribution to the local supply chain, the local economy, to jobs and skills. That means that there are more complex obligations on the recipient of some of these subsidies. In addition, we've covered some of the political difficulties around low carbon growth, and green levies are quite controversial. They are often levied straight onto consumers, so energy bill payers, and this sort of pressure on green levies is likely to continue. And the last point I wanted to mention just relates to the fact that it's a complex picture, and often you have a project that benefits from various levels of support at different within the same market or across jurisdictions, and it's quite important to be aware that how they overlap and whether that is allowed under the relevant regime. I'll pass back to you, Vivek.
Thanks, Claudia. All right, I think we're going next to Dave to speak to district energy.
Thanks, Vivek. I love this slide from the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. It shows U.S. estimated energy consumption, and this particular one is from 2023. As you can see, in the US, we waste about 2/3 of our energy. 2/3 of our energy is rejected. Only 1/3 of the energy is actually put to beneficial use. So moving on, so I just think this slide highlights the decarbonization opportunities in the United States. So moving on to the next slide, district energy presents an opportunity to decarbonize at scale. So whether it's district heating, district cooling, or both combined, what district energy allows is aggregation of heating loads, and it smooths out the load curves. Therefore, it makes a more efficient use of the energy sources. And when you add combined heat and power, if you noticed on Christian's slides earlier, there were multiple potential inputs that involved CHP, or combined heat and power, also known as cogeneration. So when you hit that cogeneration, you can also get up to 70% efficiency, which is a massive improvement over the 2/3 of energy that is typically wasted in the United States. And as we discussed earlier, state and local governments will likely be driving decarbonization efforts in partnership with corporates, and district energy systems can help you comply with those local and state regulations, as well as hit your own internal targets. Some examples of some state and local decarbonization initiatives are the state of Washington's Clean Buildings Performance Standard. That affects buildings with greater than 20,000 square feet, and New York City's Local Law 97 that establishes building emission targets for 24 to 29 with stricter emissions targets starting in 2030. So district energy systems can help you comply with these local laws and regulations that are coming on, as well as helping you hit important certifications such as LEED. So from a legal perspective, you need to understand the jurisdiction in which your company operates. There's going to be state and local regulations in place governing carbon emissions potentially. So if you own an existing building or a campus of buildings or you're developing them, you need to know what the regulations are and what your internal targets are and see how district energy might be able to help you comply with those regulations. And common legal issues are going to be energy rates and how they're set, the cost of service extensions and capital charges, the need for easements, and the need for other facilities that may be necessary in providing the service. You should also look for tax credits that may be available for these energy efficiency enhancing solutions like combined heat and power. And again, CHP is one of those potentially at-risk solutions under the next administration. Finally, a few risks. I think there's a very real risk of Inflation Reduction Act repeal, at least including tax credits for CHP and other energy sources. Also, President-elect Trump has indicated he plans to impose tariffs. So whether that's a negotiating tactic or not, the risk is out there. And so if tariffs are enacted, there's a chance that material prices may increase. And the last risk, of course, is in the US, we've had a number of ESG lawsuits by shareholders arguing essentially that pursuing ESG strategies waste corporate resources to the detriment of shareholders. So those are just a few risks in a very brief overview of district energy. So thanks, and back to you, Vivek.
Thanks, Dave. And over to you, Hazel, on carbon markets.
Perfect, thank you. And I'm going to skip along here quickly because I do want us to have a few minutes at the end for a Q&A. I think the big item here to talk about is the opportunity. So when we talk about carbon markets, we often hear about things, say, in Guardian articles or a few other newspapers or news outlets around the world. They're often negative. We don't look at it per se, or don't have the knowledge base per se of looking at it for what it does incentivize. So what we're seeing in the markets is both on the voluntary and on the compliance side is this is a almost a new and newfounded revenue stream. So if you're able to do, for example, or required to do carbon capture and utilization credits or underground sequestration to create a new power plant, you also, through certain different types, in Canada would be a compliance credit, internationally it might be a voluntary credit, would be able to generate a credit for that sequestration at the same time. That sequestered credit can be sold on the market for an additional revenue stream, especially if you are sequestering more than what you're producing or needed to offset your actual, emissions. Similarly, we see this where we see a decoupling between the power generation of renewables and the sale of RECs or offsets. So renewable energy credits are quite commonly traded in North America, but actually a number of the compliance markets have credits that can be generated from putting renewable sources onto the grid. So if you're in a market where you're able to contract that power and then maybe do an offtake on the carbon offset off of that, you're now diversifying your revenue quite a bit. The other thing we're seeing is that, you know, as new technologies develop, one of the opportunities is capturing that actual reduction. So, you know, there are grants, there are subsidies, there are incentives from the governmental side around the world, generally, to incentivize this. But if you're able, and we've worked with a number of clients on this, they've say developed a process or developed an item or a manufacturing method that actually reduces carbon emissions in whatever technology or industry they're working in. We are able to help them, and there's lots of, you know, entities that do this, write a methodology and get it approved by a registry, which then creates credits. Those credits then are sold into the market. That revenue again helps the company, but also creates additional incentives for using that technology more and more. So we're seeing a lot of upside for those developers, for investors in those early projects. And it doesn't have to be, and what we're seeing is we see the news articles about a lot of the large projects, but you're not a lot of them, some of them that may have had negative connotations to them. We're seeing a tightening of all the methodologies, of the structures, of transparency, so that it is seen as less risky for people to invest in it. But we're also seeing a lot of the upside. So when the investor is able to invest in that new technology, is able to invest into that transition, and in return have a revenue stream from those offsets, it has become very valuable. So just onto the risk side for 1 minute, and then I'll jump off. On the risk side, there's obviously, we're still having some of the reputational risk. And the way to actually address this is through due diligence, because there are a lot of great projects out there. There's a lot of great incentives out there, but you need to be doing the due diligence, understanding what you're looking at. And because these are quite diverse, they do add up in due diligence costs. So if you're doing the due diligence, you can minimize the reputational risk. But it is more costly to do due diligence on these types of projects than on, say, a standard energy, mining, resource type of project, because it so much involves the regulatory framework as well as international standards and the particular people involved in the project themselves. We're also seeing, and one thing that you would be concerned about and might come up, is stakeholder pushback on using offsets for your sustainability, rather than, well, it's a very good positive and it's a way to net off or to get to your net zero. It does, you do tend to get some stakeholders that are going to say, we shouldn't be using offsets for this from another project, from another developer. We should actually be focusing on doing these more and more and actually just implementing the changes ourselves. And then the last is, there is still very little regulatory oversight in this, which makes it quite exciting, but at the same time is risky for those without having the knowledge going into it. So I'll stop there, and Vivek, you can take over.
Great, thanks, Hazel. So we're going to move to Q&A now, and I'm just checking the chat, and I don't see any questions. So let me kick things off by asking Claudia a question. And actually, Claudia, we're not going to deal with interconnection, but I think more just big picture in terms of what advice you would give, or that you give to your clients and to corporates, as to the best means of staying up to date with changing regulation in the low carbon space. What we've seen is it's rapidly evolving. It's very different from country to country. How do we stay on top of the developments? And what's the advice for how to make investment decisions going forwards?
Yeah, so I think this is an important question, because there is a lot of movement and there's a lot of things that aren't fixed. And I think one thing I would say is that really engaging in the processes that are out there, whether it's a government consultation or an industry body, that there is a lot of scope to influence the new rules as they emerge, which is quite an exciting time, really. So I would say get in early, present data to the decision makers, and be part of the conversation in terms of how the regulation is changing. And I think that's quite important. And there might be situations actually where there is a risk. So obviously there are some sorts of business models where I've discussed where there's a form of political risk protection when you're entering into a new contract. You're protected against changes of law. There'll be other projects where that doesn't exist. So then it's just understanding the risk and factoring it into the decision. Sometimes that's the only way to go about it.
Right. Thanks, Claudia. I'm just looking at the chat now. And this is interesting. So this is about community support for hosting low carbon technologies and measures. So the question really is, how could the UK government, but I think the question could be asked for any government, whether it's federal, state level or municipal, how can governments, what can they do to better promote local acceptance of low carbon technologies? And who wants to take that one?
I'll jump in a little bit. We just
UK should be Claudia, should be.
So I'll jump in because we just learned this lesson in the US, perhaps. The headlines after the Trump win were it's the economy. So I think you need to make the case in a dollars and cents point of view to the locals that these low carbon technologies make financial sense. That is the key to me, that you need to, local governments and state governments need to engage in educational opportunities with their constituents and make the financial case for low carbon technology. So that's my 2 cents.
Great.
Thanks,
Dave.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think there is a UK government answer that's different to other countries, and I think actually there's already there are many people who are right behind the projects, but I guess how they're rolled out and how the relevant local communities are consulted with is quite important. So feeling part of the process rather than having something imposed on them is probably in a part of the solution.
Absolutely. So early engagement, active engagement, meaningful engagement, and making the case in terms of the economic and the environmental benefits is what I heard. So as we move to the end now, we're really focused on our ESG webinar series being focused on what's most important to you. And with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to Neve to do another short poll in relation to what you think our future series on ESG should look like.
Thanks, Vivek. So I'm actually going to pop up 2 quick polls as we close the session. The first is, as Vivek said, everything that we do from a content perspective, we are keen that it is focused on the biggest issues and challenges that you are facing. So we'd love to get a sense as to what those are. So the options you'll see on the screen are more on energy transition. As I think you'll get a sense from the panel, we could stay on for a number of hours on this topic. So would you like to hear more about that? We're conscious COP is just around the corner. What about circular economy? Christian touched on it in his diagram earlier. Or is it down along the list? Climate-related litigation, human rights and ethical supply chains. We've just touched on some of probably the bigger topics that tend to get the most headlines here. But if it's something else entirely, pop it in the chat, and we'd also love to get your sense of that. I can see lots of people getting involved. I'm going to give this one a quick quiz, so just 2 seconds really to indicate your view here. But we'd also love to hear from you at esgprogram@dentons.com if there's something else in particular that you'd really like to see us turn the focus to. So I'm going to end the poll and share the results with you all, because it is obviously a useful benchmarking exercise always. So I think by the looks of our results that you're not giving a rest to our panel from today, and this has certainly hit the mark in terms of interest. So lovely to see that feedback. I think the panel will be, I'll be after them again for more sessions, it looks like here. But I think it's also a nice reflection of some of the top issues as you move down through the different options that are also on the list. I'm going to pop up as people are leaving a second poll on COP, but Vivek, I'd like to, while we do that, hand back to you just to close the session, because I am conscious of time.
Absolutely. So I will close today's session by saying a big thank you to everyone for joining us today and taking the time to hear what we have to say, and also for providing an endorsement to have us present again in the future. Thank you as well to David, Hazel, Claudia, and Christian for their input today and for their contributions always. We'd love to get your feedback on how we did today, and so feel free to post in the chat or do send us a note at esgprogram@dentons.com. If you'd like the materials that we presented today, we can also provide those by email. And of course, if ever you need any help with your energy transition journey, whatever it looks like, wherever it may be in the world, we'd be happy to help. So do contact any one of us anytime directly. So that concludes our session for today. Do enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you very much.